bend bows on a rig are a very important tool for sculpting a pose and for really refining how you want a final pose to look. They are part of pretty much any polished workflow, especially in feature film, and really help to push your posing and your animation from okay to a work of art, because you are literally sculpting the pose. So a good example of bend bows here, there we go through here, is let's say on this leg, I'm going to raise this character's leg up right there. So you'll notice that by default, the shape of the leg, we get this kind of bump up here where you have the quadricep muscles, which is correct. And then there's this little dip right here, right above the knee. And that is technically correct. That anatomically would be there. But stylistically, it creates this kind of weird wiggle in the leg. And sometimes we want to simplify a shape. We want to just get a very clear, clean line through a leg, or any limb really. So how do I fix that? How do I shape this to match what I want? Well, on most rigs you will have bend bows, deformers, sculptors. There's different names for every single one of these. Essentially, they are controls that will allow us to pose out the limbs. So right here, if I select the leg, I have the bend bows. I will turn those on, and now we get this whole assortment of controls that I can use to adjust the shape of the limbs and really just get whatever I want. So for example here, I could just take this leg and just ever so slightly shape it like so. And now you get just this nice clean line right along the top. Or if I wanted to avoid that curve and go for more of a straight line to really push some power in that leg, straight lines tend to be much more powerful, I can start to shape it a little bit more like this. Now that top of the leg is much straighter. We have less of a curve. I have full control over how this shape is presented to the audience. This comes in very handy on the arms. Many times when you have a rig and you start to bend the arms, let's kind of bring the arm forward here and let's bring the whole clavicle forward like so. You'll notice that your curves kind of go backwards sometimes. So for example, let's say we have this top view of the character. See how the arm is bending back here instead of creating this nice arc that follows through. I would want the line of action to go from the shoulder through the arm and into the fingertips right here. But instead I get this kind of backwards arc right there. So once again, you can turn on the bend bows and I can just shape this ever so slightly and make sure I don't select the head there. Shape this ever so slightly to get that bend to flow through the arm right there. Now you can go really far with this and start to break things, but oftentimes the bend bows are just for nice subtle changes. And even with the hand, it'll allow me to get a better line from the thumb to the line of the arm right here. Instead of, let me exaggerate, you get this sort of wiggle. I can now exaggerate the straight line on the inner arm right there. So bend bows are hugely helpful. They will allow you to take your work from, again, okay to polished to a fine degree. Now, it's great when a rig has bend bows. It's awesome. My hat's still crooked. It's awesome when a rig has bend bows. But you will sometimes get a rig that just doesn't have them. It's not built into the rig. It's not even set up in any way. So for example, I have a rig here. Let me turn off this one and bring in another rig. So this is the Ogre rig. And this rig is a much older rig. It doesn't have bend bows. I can bend the elbow here and we get some nice muscle deformation right there, which is really cool. But there's no bend bows on this character. So let's say I'm posing out this character and same situation, I'm posing them out and I really want to push that line of action in that arm. I want to exaggerate the curve in any way. And it could be the arm, the leg, even the body. How can I get that into that character when I don't have any control for it? Well, luckily we can build our own. And building our own is actually not that complex. There's just a few different things that we have to pay attention to and be careful of as we create them. So the basis here is that we need to be able to deform the geometry. We need to be able to select the body and deform it in a way that is animatable, resettable, so a way that we can reset the pose when we want to and then repose it out again, as well as non-destructive. We don't want something that is essentially going to be the final stage. We have to put this in, and once you put it in, you can't animate it again. It's the final thing, it's done, can't touch it. No, we want to be able to go back if we have to and repose the character into a totally new pose and then sculpt it again. So how do we do that? Well, first thing is we need to be able to select the geometry of the rig. Right now, I can't select the geometry right there. So on this rig, I'm going to select the root control here, go to the options, and I'm just going to set the geo display to normal. Now on this rig, the way I got to the options, if anyone is using this rig, you select the root control and hit the right arrow key. This is going to pick walk. It's essentially moving from one node on your rig to another, and select the option node. This is a very old school way of setting up the options on rigs. Most rigs don't do this anymore because a lot of people don't realize that you can pick walk, and then all the options are hidden and no one ever finds them. So once I'm in here, I just set the geo display to normal. This means that I can now select things. And essentially, I want to add what's called a lattice deformer to a part of the object. I'm going to do the lower arm here for the demo. Now, a lattice deformer is essentially a deformer that gives you points, a lattice, that you can use to morph whatever is within the deformer. So as an example here, I've got the body selected. I'm just going to go to deform, lattice, and you can see I get this whole grid here. If I select any points within here, I can now morph whatever is within, like so. Now, we don't want to apply that to the whole body, because if I just want to add a little bend bow to the arm, I don't want to have to destroy the face and the body in order to do that. So we're going to apply it to a very specific part of the body. There's different ways you can do this, but in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the faces of the object I want to apply the lattice deformer to. This way it doesn't affect anything else in any other way. So for this rig, not only do I have to apply it to the arm, but this character also has these bracers on his arm. I would need to apply this to the bracers as well, because if I don't, once again, let's just add this. Oh, and I think I undid my, there we go, my selection. So if I just apply it to the body and I use my lattice deformer, you'll notice that the clothing, in this case, the bracer, the arm brace there, they're not moving. That's not good. I want everything to move together. Otherwise, I can't adjust the wrist in any way. So for this, I'm going to apply it to the lower arm of this character. And let's apply it. Let's actually do the right arm. It's just easier for me to select things. So I'm going to take the arm, or the body, and the bracer here. Select both of those. Right click, and I'm going to select faces for both the bracer and the arm. Now for the bracer, I can just double click to select all the faces. I really want to just apply everything to the whole bracer there. But for the arm, I want to select just a section of the arm. So I'm probably going to go, let's go up to this point here. So above this little patch of fur on the back end there. And then I'm just going to select all the faces within there. Now, you'll notice that when I click and drag to select here, I'm not selecting faces. Why? Well, this is because the bones of the rig, the joints, are active right now. I can see them. If for some reason you have those visible, you want to turn off joints. We're going to bring them back later, but joints kind of get in the way with selections, both for animation and for this kind of stuff, creating deformers and whatnot. So with this, I'm going to select, once again, that arm. Let's click and drag to select the faces here. And I'm actually also going to turn off the controllers just to make sure I don't accidentally select those. The shortcut for that is Alt-1 to turn off any NURBS control. And let's go into wireframe. I want to make sure I select the wrist all the way down into the hand there. Okay. So I think I've got everything. I can just double check right through here. Pretty good. So, sake of argument, let's say that's exactly what I want to select. Now I can go to Deform, Lattice, and this will apply a lattice to only that part of the body, which is very nice because if I start to adjust anything at all, it's not going to affect the body or the hand. If he does this, where he puts one hand over the other, I can deform the part of the arm without the hand also getting deformed with it. So that's going to be very helpful. Now, the problem with this right now is that this lattice deformer by default is created in line with the world. So you can see it's facing forward and is perfectly horizontal. Well, that's great for a lot of things, but in this case, I want to deform the arm along the length of the arm, not in some sort of odd angle. So if I try to move my lattice right now and just rotate it, I'm just going to be doing horrible things to his arm. But if I take my lattice deformer and I take the lattice and the base, lattice deformers are made out of two different parts, lattice and base. I can take these and adjust these, and you can see I can just rotate it. And as long as I make sure that the part of the body that I want to adjust is within the lattice deformer, it's not part way out like that, I will be good. So I can adjust this here. Let's make sure everything's fitting in like so. Now it's lining up with the arm. If I go back to my lattice points, I still get to morph it right there. So I've lined this up in a way that now allows me to easily adjust my points right here. So very nice, very easy. Now, some things I should mention about the lattice deformer is that when you first create it, you will have the ability to adjust the divisions of the lattice deformer. This is how much detail do you want to have in it. Right now, I have 5 divisions on the T axis. The T in this case is the up and down. I could make that a little less, so I have less deformers available, or I can keep it at 5. I could even go, especially let's say you have a long tail or something like that, you could add a whole bunch of different divisions if you want. I would say for like an arm or something like this, keeping it around 4 or 5, so you only have 2 or 3 points of adjustment, are very important. Or that should be enough to give you all the detail you need. So we've got that. If I had a different division length, so for example, I wanted to maybe add a bend to the arm inset. So like, for example, if I'm going to push into the arm this way and bend it like it's folding a piece of pizza or something like that. I don't know why that went to my mind there. I don't even fold my pizza when I eat it. I could add that, and that's just going to give me more kind of control over the arm in different ways. For most Benbows style controls, just divisions along the length is going to be all you need. So that's what I'm going to do here. Okay, great. So we've got the lattice. We can add the deformers. Yay. Now, are we all set? No. There's 2 main issues that we're going to run into at the moment. The first, and more important with a lattice, is that we are not going to be able to animate this correctly. Lattice points are like vertices. They're like faces. They are not made to be animated. They don't have a attribute, an X, Y, and Z coordinate space that is easy to move. If I take this this lattice point here and start keying it, what is going to end up happening is I'm just going to not be able to reset it. And I can show this here by looking at my CVs right here. That is the value of the default position for this lattice point. Negative 0.5 and 0.167. This one here, 0.5, 0.5. 0.5, 0.167. I don't want to have to remember these. I don't want to have to deal with all of that and all these random values all the time. I want a quick 0, reset. I just select everything, hit 0, done. That's all I want. I also want an easy way to key this because all of these are within the CV section. That's not going to key well. It's not going to show up on the timeline correctly. It's going to be a pain. So I need a quick way to animate this. The other issue is right now, the lattice affects anything that is within the lattice. So if I add a bend bow to the arm right here, and the character is a little low res, so I'm going to select the geometry and hit 3 on the keyboard to soften them up. This is just going to give us more detail in the bends here. So I'm going to go extreme here. I'm going to really bend this like that. Great. We've got this really awesome bend bow. We're putting more detail in the character. But as I animate the character, the moment they leave that lattice, the hand just resets and you get this weird deformation. It is only distorting things that are within the lattice. As soon as it leaves the lattice, it's no longer deformed. So we've got those two main issues. And then to answer the question here, is it possible to mirror the lattice to the other arm? No, you would have to create a new lattice. So you'd have to do each side individually, unfortunately. Because it's applying to very specific faces on the character, not to a mirrored surface, if that makes sense. So we've got this in place. Let's first get it to follow the character. So I want to be able to, for example, bend this elbow, and the lattice deformer should move with it. Well, that's actually pretty simple, as long as you understand how lattice deformers work. If I move just the lattice here on its own, that's just going to deform the rig. If I move the base on its own, that's going to deform the rig. But if I take both the lattice and the base, group them together, and I'm just going to call this lattice. It's always good to name your objects. Lattice group. Right here. There we go. Lattice group. I can now take this and move it. So I can take that and it just moves around. Perfect. Now what I want is I want it to follow the arm. So as the arm bends, the lattice moves with the arm. Keeps the arm contained. Now, the way I want to do this is I do not want to constrain the lattice deformer to the elbow here, to this control. Technically, this would work. As I would bend the elbow here, the lattice would follow. Great. But what happens if I switch the arm into IK mode? I no longer have that elbow control. Now I have an IK control. It won't follow anymore. Whenever you're constraining something to an arm, in this case a deformer, but it could be a prop, it could be some sort of bracer, a shield on the arm, whatever you want, you very rarely want to do it to one of the FK or IK controls. You either want to do it to an arm control, that's what this control is right here, or directly to a joint on the skeleton. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Show, Joints, and now I can actually see the skeleton here. I'm going to take the elbow joint right there, select the lattice group right here. I'm going to go to Constrain, and I'm going to add a parent constraint right there. So with this, I now have that elbow joint leading the lattice deformer. So let me turn off joints once more, go back to this, and let's bend that elbow. We're in IK mode right now. As I move, lattice moves with the arm. If I needed to switch to FK mode, right there, I can bend the elbow, it moves with the arm. Good. And at this point, my bend bow, let's just give an example here, is going to bend with everything. So as I move the arm, I keep that horrible little wiggle in his whole arm. Done. So it follows along great. We've got all of that pretty much done. Now, that's the first issue. Second issue, how do we animate this in a way that is easy to work with? The last thing I want is to have to select CVs and lattice points and key them manually. It's a pain. It's hard to reset. It's not fun. I've done that for a few shots. Whew, no, I'd never want to do that again. So what we can do is we can create another deformer. What we're going to create is what's called a cluster. A cluster is a deformer that essentially encapsulates a selection of vertices, faces, edges, or lattice points, and allows you to move them together with a handle. It essentially creates a handle that allows you to move certain attributes or certain aspects of a rig. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to select which lattice points I want to move as a group. I would very rarely just move one individually here. Like, it's just going to stretch the skin as if you're pulling on just one point of the skin. Most bend bows, it's a bend bow. You want to actually bend the bone through the arm. So I would most likely always be selecting, let's say, these 4 joints together and moving them like so to allow me to bend that part of the body. And then I would select these ones together and move that. Now, one thing I don't want to do, and actually for the sake of argument, let's add a 5th one right in there. So we just have more to animate. Now, one thing I don't want to move is the first and last section of this lattice. I don't want to adjust this because this is going to create a very harsh connection right in here. It's going to start to pinch geometry. As long as I'm only animating the ones within here, I'm always going to get a smooth transition back into the default pose, or as smooth as you can get if you start to really break the rig like that. If you start to adjust them on the ends here, you're going to get a much harsher cut, potentially, like you can see right here. So I know that I'm not going to use these, and I know that I'm going to use the lattice points in this kind of configuration, just each level as a whole. So what I can do is I'm going to select all of these lattice points here, go to deform, that's it, deform cluster. And you'll notice that that creates a cluster handle right there. And a cluster handle is a little control that I can select, and it moves all those points. But I've got attributes right there, very easy to reset. I can rotate everything just as I want. I could even scale it if I want. I've got all the controls that I could ever want right there. Perfect. It's exactly where I want it to be. So with this, I can now just create a whole bunch of clusters right through here. Now, there is one issue with this, and it's not a huge issue, but it is something you want to be aware of, is that by default, the cluster is not going to line up with the actual axis of the object. So for example, let's say I want to select this lattice deformer. I want to move it along the axis of the arm, either up and down along the arm or kind of perpendicular to the arm. My handles right here, if I move this to the side, you can see it's kind of moving diagonally here. If I move it up and down, it's moving diagonally in comparison to the arm. So I want to be able to set these so that they are actually straight, or as straight as I can, before going too far with this. Now, there's a few different ways you can do this. Let's see. I don't usually do this way, but I'm going to see if I can adjust the pivot this way. Like I said, I don't usually move things through here. Nah, I'm not a huge fan of that. You can adjust things through here, but I always feel like it can start to get really weird unless you really know what you're doing. For me personally, what I will do is before I start creating the cluster, I'm just going to line up that arm so that it's as straight as I can get it. So for example here, I'm just going to take my rig, line that up so it's kind of straight front to back and straight up and down. So if you want to double check this, the front and side views are great. So I can check through here. Yep, wow, it's actually pretty darn straight. I actually got that pretty good on my first try. And then side view, I can see that I'm not seeing a 3/4 view of this. So let's kind of show that here. I'm not seeing this 3/4. It's just straight lines. There you go. I know it's perfectly vertical and horizontal. Now, when I create my clusters, so take this and then deform cluster right there. As I move the cluster, it lines up with that control right through there. Perfect. Now I can keep going here. So let's create another lattice point right here, or a cluster, I should say. So I'm going to select those. And because I just created a cluster, I can hit G on the keyboard, G as in gorilla, and that'll repeat the last command, which was create a cluster. And then once again, lattice point, select those, G, there's my clusters. Perfect. Now I've essentially got a bend bow right there. And I can adjust that arm and get whatever curves I want in there. Yes, very nice. Now, let's see, backtrack, good point. I think it's important to mention that when you are constrained to a joint, it's important to select the joints that are skinned to a character. Because usually for IK/FK switches, there might be 3 sets of joints, 1 driven joint and 2 driver joints. Exactly. You always want to select the actual joint that's skinned to the character that the character is following. Sometimes there can be multiple layers of joints, so you just have to be very careful which one you actually select. So that is a very good point. Thank you for mentioning that. So with this, I've got the clusters in place. Yay! I've got controls that I can actually use and animate, and all is good. Wow, isn't this great? Isn't this amazing? We can just start animating this, no problem. Not quite. There's one other thing that we're going to run into with this, and that is when I reset my character here, those clusters stay behind. As I move my character, clusters do not move with the object that you just applied them to. They stay where they are, but they still keep the relationship with the original object. So if I move this left to right, you'll notice that the object is still moving correctly here. Up and down, it's still moving up and down. Well, yay, but that's going to be a pain to animate. If my character is swinging their arm up in this big pose right here, and I just broke that arm, wow. If I've got this arm way up here and the character is stomping all the way across the screen over there, I don't have to find my clusters at the root of the world here and then go, okay, which direction am I rotating this? Oh, wait, this way. No, this way. This way. That's going to be a pain. I want controls right where the lattice is, right in the arm. So at any point, I can just pose out the arm right where it is. How do we do that? Well, once again, we just kind of have to understand how the deformers work in Maya. Clusters, they keep this relation between the two objects, but they can't be moved afterwards. They kind of just stay in that default position. There are ways to have them move along with the character, but it can be a little bit more of a pain than anything else to set all of that up. And to be fair, I don't even want to animate clusters. I want to animate a control curve. All of these curves that we see on our character, these are control curves. They are NURBS curves, a type of object in Maya that we can use to select and move objects. They drive the object forward. And a little Danny, hey, thanks for the sub. Aw, thank you so much. Also, hello, hope you're doing well. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. So, we want to have these clusters to move this object, but I don't want to actually animate the cluster itself. I want to animate a control that moves the cluster. And it seems like an extra step, but it's going to make our animation lives a little easier. So how do we set this up? Well, let's actually clean this up. So I can take these clusters, I'm just going to group them together, and we're going to call this cluster group right there. And now I'm going to create my own custom controls for this rig. So I'm going to go to create NURBS primitive circle right here. I'm just going to take this NURBS circle and I'm going to snap it to where the cluster is. So I'm going to hide the geometry of the rig here. That's Alt 2 on the keyboard for the shortcut. It's just going to make it a little easier to take this. I'm going to hold down the V key, V as in vertex, and then middle mouse drag on the CV, or sorry, on the cluster right there. And that will just snap that whole object right there. With this, I can now duplicate the next one, snap it down, duplicate, snap it down, like so. So now I've got 3 controls right in line with my clusters right there. Now let's bring the geometry back because I do want to make sure that these are easy to select. They're not too big so that they start getting cut off with things. And we have something like this. So we've got our 3 different controls, and we're going to call this lower arm. Let's see. And then you typically want like, let's say L, or sorry, this is the right arm, right underscore lower arm. And then this is going to be, we'll call it Benbow, just BB1, like that. So you pick a name. You don't have to go as complex as this. It could just be Benbow1. There you go. But it's always good to name these. So name that, and then name that, and actually name it fully. Put the number. There we go. So there we go. We have our controls, and they are numbered and ready to go. So how do I connect all of these together? Well, it's very similar to what we did with the lattice deformer. I want the controls here to follow the arm. Now, before I do that, I also want these to not have these weird values, these odd scales, these odd translates. So I'm going to take these and go to Modify, Freeze Transformation. This essentially takes its new position and zeroes everything out, puts it right back to default. I'll do that for all of these controls. I'm just hitting the G key again to repeat that last command. Then I can take all of these controls here. I'm going to group them. We'll call this Bend Bow Group right there. And I am going to, I could either constrain that group to the elbow, same as I did before, or I could even parent the whole group to the lattice group right here, because that is also following the elbow, one or the other. But you'll notice that those controls now follow everything. Now, for me personally, I like to constrain it because I like to keep everything separate. So once again, let's go in here. Let's bring back our joints. Find that elbow joint right there. And then I'm going to select my Benbow group, constrain, parent, like so. Turn off the joints. There we go. Now, if I bend that arm, all of those controls move with it. Perfect. So at this point, there's a few things that we need to do. One is the lattice is kind of getting in the way at this point. We know that the lattice works. We know that the clusters are moving the lattice. I don't need to keep seeing the lattice here. It's just not necessary. So I'm just going to go into my lattice group right here and turn off the visibility. There we go. Cleans it up. It's still working. So if I select my cluster here, still works, but now we just don't have to look at it and have it mess up our viewport. The next thing is I need to have my new controls here actually control the clusters. I need to connect them together. Now, there's a lot of different ways you can do that in Maya. You can do it in a node editor, you can do it in a hypergraph, you can do it all sorts of different ways. For me, I'm just going to use the connection editor in Maya. So I'm going to select Windows, General Editors, Connection Editor. Now the connection editor essentially just connects one attribute to another. So one equals the other. That's it. If I make a change on one attribute, it'll make a change on the other one. And when you're connecting them, you're connecting them from one attribute, the one on the left here. We can see that with the from to here. The one to the left to the one to the right. So I want my control right here. When I move it, it should then move the cluster for me. So I'm going to select this control. I'm going to load that on the left side. I'm going to take my cluster, the first one up here, reload that on the right side, like so. And then I'm going to find my translates, rotates, and scale on both sides here. Let's just move those to the top. So translate, I'm going to select it here on the left and connect it to the translate on the right. Same thing with rotate, same thing with scale. Now, when I adjust this control, it's going to move the cluster. And if I select the cluster, you can see all of its attributes are yellow, showing that those are connected and are being controlled by something else. So now I can just move this control here. I can rotate it, I can scale it, and it's just adjusting the cluster for me. So we're going to do that for all the different controls. So reload that one, reload that to the right, translate to translate, rotate to rotate, scale to scale. Do the next one. So reload that on the left, reload this on the right, translate, translate, rotate, rotate, scale, scale. There we go. At this point, if we've done this right, all our controls follow along. Perfect. Now, I don't need to see the clusters anymore. They're not useful to me. They're working on the background, but I don't need to see them. So I'm going to take my cluster group, turn off its visibility right there. Now, why not constrain to a cluster? I could constrain the clusters to the control as well. Honestly, it would do the same thing. For me, I like to do that direct connection because it's just a few less nodes, and it just makes sure that there's no offsets and nothing accidentally gets turned off somehow. It's just going to be a straight direct connection. But honestly, in the end, it's gonna pretty much do the same thing. You could even parent them. So let me undo this. What I could do is I could actually no, it wouldn't do the same thing. And that's because of the way clusters are handled typically. So when I do this connection, what it is doing is it's saying that the value of these attributes, the value of translate X, is going to equal the value on the translate X here. That's what we want, one to equal the other. A constraint or a parent doesn't create this value of if your translate X is 5, your translate X is 5. It's going to do if you're over here, you're also over here, regardless of value. So if I was to constrain this, so I'm going to select this control and then the handle right there, or the cluster, constrain parent. As I bend the arm, you're going to get this. Because you can see that as I'm bending the arm, this control is now moving the cluster with it, which is then adjusting the cluster. The cluster can't move. The cluster has to stay in place and only get adjusted when this control actually adjusts itself. So you can't constrain it or parent that cluster. You need to connect it. So with this, let's do that again. Reload left, reload right, translate, rotate, scale. There we go. So you can see now, as this moves, this elbow, these are staying in place. The value of this control is still zeroed out because it hasn't been moved yet. And only when I move this, now it's adjusting that cluster right back there. That's a good point to bring up. I'm glad you asked that question. I thought there was a reason, and until I actually did it, it didn't click. So with this, we now have that arm pretty much set up to go. So what can we do now? Well, one thing I like to do is, I'm not a huge fan of the default control color here. It's just not super easy to see sometimes. So I can just take the entire group here. I'm going to open up the attribute editor, and under the display section, I'm going to go to drawing overrides, enable overrides, and I'm going to change the color index. And this will essentially change what the default colors of anything within that group look like. So now I can just put these to something like pink, or usually Benbows, at least in most rigs, are kind of a beige color. So I could do something like that. And there we go. So it's really just a way to help differentiate them, especially if you have other controls that are a similar color. So one thing I wouldn't want to do is make these red, because now which one's the main arm control? I can't really tell. I want a control color that's going to be very easy to see. Oh, that's a Benbow. That's a very specific set of controls on this rig. So with that, we've essentially finished our Benbows. I can now take my character, put them back here. I could have them animate walking through the scene. Let's do what we did before. Let's raise that arm, and I'm destroying that poor arm. Let's move the clavicle to help with that a little bit. I could have the arm bend forward right there. And then if I want to adjust my Benbow, I can just take these and bend the arm like that. And now I can just get a nice clean line right through there. So yeah, that's pretty much it. And you can then do the same thing on the upper arm. You can do the same thing for the lower arm. You could add Benbows to the individual finger joints. And this is actually something that I probably wouldn't do, because it's going to be a lot of work. But if ever I have a shot that's really close up on the hand, there are times when finger joints just, they don't look good. And I've seen this on a lot of rigs, where as you bend the fingers, they're just too round. They don't have like a sharp enough point for the bone, so you don't get the knuckle shape in there, or the fingers have weird bends in them sometimes. At those points, I could just add some lattice deformers to each joint and shape them to get exactly the shape I want. Now again, that's like really, if I'm doing a close-up like this, where the hand's like right on screen and it's not fuzzy, let's see if it'll focus. If I'm doing something like that, and I want those very specific bone shapes in there, okay, fine. If it's over here, I'm not going to care. Not typically. That's a lot of work for not much reward. So yeah, I hope that's helpful. And then the other thing you can do is, now that we have this set up, we can always turn off our Benbow visibility right here if I don't want to see them, if I just want to keep animating. And once again, they are easy to key and reset, because, hey, we've got these attributes, zero that out, arm is back in place. And this is really cool as well, especially on rigs that don't have musculature to them. Because right now, this rig, if I bend his arm, you can see that the bicep flexes, which is really cool. That's really awesome. But what if I wanted to have this motion here, where as the hand is opening and closing, you see how my arm is shifting ever so slightly? I don't know if that's coming through right there on camera. You can see the muscles in the arm flexing. Well, I can do that where maybe he like grips really hard, and I can flex that muscle now and just scale that up ever so slightly. So we really feel that hand muscle connection. If your character is doing this and they don't have like a bicep control in there to adjust the actual bicep flexing, you could do that, just have that lattice and go whoop. And now you've got that flex in there. You really feel the muscles reacting to the arm. That can be a really cool thing. And then with connections, you can go even further by having the actual rotation of the arm cause the muscle to flex and create your own automatic muscle flexing. which is just really cool. I would very rarely do that for most animations. Instead, I would just copy, this is just a little cheat here that you can do. In Polish, you would take your elbow bend control, copy the animation from that, go to your bend bow control, and just copy the bend to the scale. And now whenever it bends, the arm flexes. Whenever it stretches, it thins out. And now you've got an automatic musculature in the arm. You could do the same thing with the hands. When the fingers close, you scale that up. When it opens, it thins out. You could do something like that ever so slightly. And now you've got these automatic, or I should, it's not automatic, but polished controls with very little work. So yeah, that's the demo. That's how to create your own custom bend bows. And once again, you can apply these to anything. Arms, legs, fingers. You could apply it to the body. You could do it to the face if you wanted to, although that's much harder because you'd have to do it kind of to the whole head versus just one part, but it's still possible. So yeah. Now, if anyone has questions on that, definitely let me know. There were some questions that I saw. First, Tiki, bonjour, ça va bien? Let's see. Where did you learn all that stuff? I mean, you can do everything in Maya. A lot of it is just self-taught. I've been playing with Maya for many, many years. I don't know everything by far. A lot of my general knowledge, aside from animation, is just that general knowledge. I would never classify myself as a rigger. I do know modeling and sculpting. I would never classify myself as a modeler or sculptor, especially with a lot of the new tools that have come out recently. I need to catch up on that. But I know enough to essentially help my animations and to give myself more freedom when I work. So that I'm not limited by the rig or limited by a situation, which can be very, very helpful. Especially on situations like this where I'm told, here's the rig you need to use, and I don't have the control I need for whatever reason. I can just build that control in or create my own version of it if I need to. And that kind of goes into the next question, which is, I saw it up here, about... Let's see, how much do riggers hate when you customize a rig for your shot? All the riggers that I've ever talked to or interacted with don't mind at all. A lot of times when you're creating a modification to a rig like this, it's really for a very specific scenario. It's not like you're modifying the rig and going, now the rig is, now it's better. This is the way the rig should be. A lot of times, even in a studio environment, you're going to have to modify the rig for a very specific situation. There could be some controls that just didn't exist for that rig because no one else is going to use it. But on this one shot, you need those controls. You need the character to like really squash into a building, like flatten out. Maybe this one scene, the character is hammering a nail and they miss and they hit their hand, and you really want to push that hand just crunching and bending in half. No one else is going to have a shot like that on the entire film, but you need it. So at that point, you could add a lattice former and just bend the fingers and the whole hand and create your own little setup like I've done here, just to really push that more than the rig would normally allow you to do. So yeah, you can do that. Additionally, when you're at a studio, there are oftentimes nowadays tools that will allow you to really modify a rig and shape them like crazy. So this type of stuff is something you don't have to do as much nowadays, but when you're working on your own, we might have to do that because we don't have these big tools that a studio has. There are downloadable tools. I believe Josh Sobel has a tool called Anim Polish that will allow you to do certain things like this. But if it doesn't do exactly what you need, or if you have to bend it more than the tool is capable of, well, you can always use deformers or things like that, which can be very helpful. Now, there was another question about whether you would adjust this in the original rig file or in the referenced rig file. And honestly, it just depends on the shot. If I am doing something, a change that, let's say the hammer is going to hit the hand and the hand has to bend, I'm not going to do that on the original rig. I'm going to do that on the referenced rig in my scene, because it's only for this situation, and then I'm never going to have to deal with it again. I don't want to overcomplicate my rig for every single shot I work on. But if I'm going to add a bend bow to this arm, like I did on the ogre, and then go, oh, you know, that would be a really cool tool to have on all my shots. I would love to have this bend bow control on every single shot I animate on, not just this one. Then I would do it on the original, save it as a modified version, and then there we go. We're all good. Now, you have to be careful with this, because this also depends on if other people are working on your rig. So in this case, this is a rig I know it's not going to get updated, so I can make any changes I want to that, and I'm good. So I can modify the original, all good. If I'm in a studio environment, a lot of times when you're animating, the rigs are still being modified as you are working on the shot. The riggers are still building out the rigs. So if I created my own custom version of the rig that has all the bend bows and stuff I need, when the rigger then updates to the newest version of the rig, I've broken my pipeline, and it's not going, those new changes aren't going to go to my shot. So in that case, I would want to modify the reference if I know that the rigger is going to be continuing to work on the rig, or if there's any possibility of updates to the rig. So it really depends on the situation. So I hope that helps. The other thing you can do, which can be a little bit more of a pain because it's extra steps, is you create a referenced modified version. So you take the original file, you reference it into a new scene, totally new scene. You create all your modifications in there. Then you take that scene, you save it. It's all good. And what you will want to do is import the reference. So let me show this here. So you're actually going to be making 3 scenes. You've got your original, you've got your referenced version of the original, and then you create another version where you take your reference, go into the reference editor, right click on the reference, go to File, Import, Objects from Reference. That'll import them in and create them as part of the scene. You will then need to go to Windows, General Editor's Namespace Editor, and delete the namespace from the rig. This way it's basically just a clean version of the rig in your scene. Save that out as a new modified version. What this is going to do, I should draw this out because we're dealing with a lot here. So you have original rig right here. And you're going to reference that in to I would call this a work mod file. So this is what you are working on in order to create the modifications. So this is referenced. Right there. So whenever the rigger makes any changes to the original, it's going to go into the work mod, and this is the one that we have all our bend bows and cool stuff on right in here. Cool. Now, the problem with this is I can't then reference this into my animation file because I've already referenced it. If I do this, I've got a double reference, and I've broken a lot of functionality on the rig potentially. So I don't want to do that. That's going to break things. Instead, what I can do is duplicate this file, the work mod, into we'll call this the anim mod. So I've duplicated it. Wait. My spelling. There we go. something was in the wrong spot. So we'll duplicate it into this, copy and paste it. And with this one, we import everything. So everything in here is imported with no namespaces. And then from there, we reference that in. Okay, so why does this work? Well, essentially, by importing everything within this scene, what's going to happen is we no longer have that double reference. This reference no longer exists. And we can just bring that into our animation file. Now, let's say the rigger updates the file. There's a new version of the rig. All we would need to do is then open up our work modification. Everything's going to be imported in there. Everything's going to be all set, all good. The new rigger mod, or the new rigger model is going to be in there. It's all going to be set. And all of the bend bows and everything that we needed for our scene automatically applied. From there, we would just need to duplicate that scene again, import the reference, delete the namespace, and then when we save that, poof, it goes right back into our animation. So this is, I would say this is a very rare workflow. Very rarely will you ever do this. But if you do, for some reason, need to modify a rig and then have it into multiple shots while the rig is still being updated, this is a way you can do that. It's not going to be automatic because you do have to always go into this step of like duplicating and resetting things, but it's going to help, especially if you don't want to have to create those bend bows across 30 shots every single time. That would be a pain.